Tonight I will be telling 5 stories. Whether you're camping or at home, horrible things can happen anywhere, at any time. A huge thank you to the writers. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. If you enjoy the video, likes and comments are always appreciated. Subscribing if you're new is as well. Enjoy the video. And as always, I hope you all have a great night. I'm screwed. Absolutely, positively screwed. I should have never came to this godforsaken place. I'm done for and there's nothing I can do to save myself. I'll start from the beginning. I was going on my weekly camping overnighter in British Columbia, Canada, that I went on every Sunday during the summertime. I won't give an exact location, for reasons that will be clear later. The day was normal. I won't list off all the boring stuff. I'll just skip to when I set off in my Ford Explorer, and arrived at the campsite. When I say campsite, I mean hundreds of acres of woodland, owned by a family friend. When I arrived, all seemed normal. I hopped out of my car, retrieved my pack and tent from the back seat, and set off into the woods. I hiked for about 4 hours before finding a good place to set up camp. The location I chose was in a large clearing, with a creek about 100 yards away from the edge of the clearing. I put down my pack and retrieved my hatchet, and went out looking for firewood, downed trees or dead standing. After I collected enough firewood to last me well through the night, I pitched the tent and had something to eat. By now it was about 4 p.m. That meant I still had about 4 to 5 hours of daylight left, so I decided I would follow the creek and see where it goes. I tied one of my bright orange tent pegs to a stick and stuck it in the ground, marking where my camp was so I know where to turn off to get back. I won't bore you with the details of my walk. It was beautiful, but it wasn't super interesting. I walked for about an hour and decided to turn back. Now, this is where stuff starts to actually get interesting. As I was walking back, I noticed that the crunching of my feet on dry leaves seemed to echo. I didn't think much of it, until I noticed that the echo was slightly off timing with my footfalls, so I decided to test something. Mid-step, I stopped, but I heard the crunching of leaves as if I had taken a full step. Assuming that someone was following me, timing their footsteps with mine, I acted like I hadn't noticed anything, and kept walking normally. The whole time I felt this horrible sense of dread, and had this urge to run as fast as I could and not look back. But I kept my cool, and walked normally, until the footsteps behind me started to slowly speed up. They kept speeding up the more I did, so I lost my shit, and started to book it back to camp. Quickly the footsteps disappeared into the woods, and stupid me decided not to look over my shoulder to see who or what was chasing me. When I made it back to camp, I made a fire and sat down with my hatchet beside me, praying to whatever god that would listen, that whatever or whoever chased me hadn't followed me back to camp. All was silent for a long time, the bad kind of silence. The kind that says a predator is nearby. The kind that means, get the hell out of here and don't look back no matter what. Eventually the silence was shattered by an ear-splitting screech, and it was close to camp, maybe 400 yards away from the border of the clearing. I sat there, absolutely terrified, waiting for something to happen, and indeed, something did happen. But not for another hour, when I heard another scream. This time it sounded like it was coming from the edge of the clearing. I stood up and gripped my hatchet in both hands, absolutely shitting myself at this point, when I saw something in the tree line. At first glance, it just looked like a sapling. On second glance, my heart stopped. Standing there was what I could only describe as an 8-foot-tall, pale as snow, emaciated human, if you could even call such an abomination a human. We locked eyes for what felt like hours, until it got down on all fours, and charged through the clearing at terrifying speed. I turned around and booked it in the other direction, the creature giving chase. It quickly outran me, and passed. At that moment I was so confused, until it turned back around and charged straight towards me, still on all fours, and screaming that god-awful scream. Now I could see its eyes, white, yet still filled with hatred and malice. I made a split-second decision to turn to my right and run, eventually deciding to climb a pine tree. Absolutely stupid decision. But I managed to climb it before it caught up to me. But it grabbed my boot, ripping it off and tearing it to shreds. I quickly climbed up as high as I could, the creature screaming and snarling under me. I was safe. Kind of. The thing couldn't climb, or maybe it was toying with me. I sat up there for hours, and the creature just stared at me from the bottom of the tree. But eventually, it turned and slowly walked away. I told myself to wait 10 or 20 minutes, so that it had time to move away, until the thought that it's trying to lure me down drilled itself into my head. I sat for maybe an hour after that, when the worst thing I could possibly imagine happened. More appeared, some with hideous deformities that made the one that tread me look like a cute little puppy. Some had more arms, sticking out of places that arms shouldn't. More legs, more eyes. It was horrifying. A particularly scary one with 7 legs, too many eyes to count, and a large mouth in its back, decided it would attempt to climb the tree, and failed, thank God. I managed to get 2 bars of service near the top of the tree, and tried to call 911, but it never rang. With that, I lost all hope. So I decided to find a place to post this. This seems to be the only place people might actually listen. I hope I have enough service to post this, but I don't have much hope. The creatures have started attacking, for lack of a better word, the bottom of the tree. I'm so scared. I don't know how much longer I have, and I hope this gets out there. All I have is my hatchet, clipped to my belt to defend myself, and my knife. I know it won't be enough, but I'm fucked anyways, so why not try? I don't remember much about my childhood. That happens, right? As you get old, you forget most of the stuff you did and saw as a kid, and whilst this is particularly true in my case, I do in fact remember one year of my life insanely clearly, and it was when I lived in a huge 16-story apartment block with my grandparents. I couldn't tell you where my parents were at the time, and why for a whole year. I had to live with my grandparents, but that's not important. What is important is floor 16 of my then residence. What I saw that fateful day in February, on a cold winter's day, would stay with me, and subsequently my dreams, for years to come. Let me start off by telling you a little backstory of what my grandparents told me about floor 16. 2 years ago, prior to my stay with them, there was a huge fire in apartments 15 and 16. No one knew how it started, or why, but the entire block of flats had to be evacuated in order to contain the blaze. Thankfully, my grandparents and all of the residents of the building were okay. All but 2 residents, a mother and her son. They were never found. The husband of the mother and father of the child survived, and my grandparents said that for months, they couldn't get his harrowing cries and screams out of their heads. His name was Nathan. He became a recluse shortly after that horrific incident, never venturing out of his apartment after it was renovated, and no one knew what the hell he was doing up there most of the time. All my grandparents knew is that he had his food delivered weekly and only came out to recover it in the evenings when no one could see him. The people that lived in apartment 15 never returned, so he was alone up there, and no one wanted to live opposite him, which is no surprise considering the events that took place, and what I saw when I went up there the year I lived in that apartment building. So fast forward to the day that my curiosity got the better of me, and I decided it would be a good idea to go up there, and maybe see Nathan, and see what the floor actually looked like now. I was a child. Tragedies don't often haunt children like they do adults, so the remnants of what occurred up there didn't faze me. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I told my grandparents that I was going out to play with some of the neighborhood kids. The little deceitful liar I was. I got straight in the lift, and was looking at number 16, the button of which had gathered considerable dust since no one ever pressed it. I pressed it that day though. The lift slowly took me up. My grandparents lived on floor 11, so it didn't take long to get up to floor 16, but it felt like forever, and my anxiety and fear slowly building up inside me. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea. I remember thinking, but before I had the chance to change my mind, the lift made a loud ding, and before I knew it, the doors were opening. I couldn't see anything at first, as it was quite dark, and the hall lights in the building only turned on if someone was there, so I had to actually exit the lift in order for the lights to turn on. I slowly stepped off the lift, and the lights came alive. Very dim at first, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw something that truly terrified my 10-year-old self. There was a huge cross, bigger than any cross I had ever seen. It was black and had splashes of red strewn across it, and it looked like blood at first, but I'm sure it was paint. I didn't want to touch it and find out. There were flowers laid out around the entire thing. Vines were placed haphazardly around the cross. The flowers were all dead, every single one, but when my eyes adjusted even more, I saw something in the middle of the cross which scared the living shit out of me. There was a doll nailed to the middle of the cross, a doll made out of fabric. It was burnt and its eyes were missing, and it had a crude smile drawn on it with a black marker pen. The smile was horrific to look at, but what was more horrific to look at was the knife that was stuck in its chest. I could smell a faint burning smell, and as my eyes followed the smell, they immediately were fixed upon the door of apartment 16, Nathan's door. I could see a faint glow underneath it, and hear a faint but audible crying, but I was too scared to knock to see if he was okay, so instead I called out his name. The crying immediately stopped, and I could hear footsteps approaching. The glow under his door was then replaced with a shadow of 2 feet. I backed away slowly, and suddenly everything smelled of death. I turned to look at the doll again, and my heart nearly fell out of my mouth. The mouth of the doll itself was oozing red, like it was bleeding, but surely that wasn't possible. And what scared me even more at that moment was when I noticed the knife was missing. I looked around frantically, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, and where in the fuck that knife went. But the hallway became even darker, and I could barely see the monstrosity that was the cross. I backed away to the door of the lift slowly, turned and saw Nathan standing in his doorway, breathing heavily and staring at me with that same knife in his hand. I screamed and pressed the button frantically to call the lift, but it wouldn't come. Nathan then began to slowly walk towards me, knife in hand, breathing and staring but not saying a single word. I didn't want to take my eyes off of him, but I continued to frantically press the button until I could hear the lift approaching the floor slowly. Nathan was a mere few feet away from me when the doors opened and I stumbled into the lift. The doors closed slowly, and I pressed number 11 and the lift began to descend. When I got back home that day, I was sweating profusely, and my grandparents told me I was only gone about 15 minutes, and asked me what was the matter. I proceeded to tell them what happened, at which point they immediately called the police. When the police arrived and investigated floor 16, they told us there was no cross, no dead flowers, and no deformed doll. When they broke into Nathan's apartment, they found him hanging in his bathroom. He'd been dead for 4 days. I couldn't sleep for days afterwards. Nathan's face and that doll haunting my dreams. I never ventured out from my bedroom until the day my parents picked me up. I was told it was all in my imagination, that my childhood mind made it all up, and it wasn't possible that a cross that size would ever have been up there, and of course, I was told that I couldn't have seen Nathan because he'd been dead for days prior to my adventure up to his floor. But I know what I saw, and I never wanted to go back. To this day, apartment 16 remains empty, and apparently now, the lift doesn't even go up there, as the button for floor 16 is gone. During a recent thunderstorm, something unexplainable happened to me, and I am left with more questions than answers. Most days I end up sleeping late, as I spend my time playing games, watching YouTube, or reading stories on no sleep. It was a warm night and I was heading off to bed earlier than usual. The monsoon rains were aggressive in Colombo, and the night sky was constantly flashing blue due to lightning and soon after, followed by the roar of thunder. I had to unplug my electronic devices to protect them from electrical surges, thus rendering my night less eventful. Other than the heavy pouring rain and thunder, there was nothing out of the ordinary, and with nothing much to do, I turned on my ceiling fan to escape the monsoon heat and slowly dozed off. At first, everything started out as a lucid dream. I was in a state of sleep and being awake at the same time. My surroundings felt very surreal, and the atmosphere was very thick. I had a sense of being watched. In the state of lucid dreaming, I was in bed laying on my back. I was staring up at the ceiling fan, which was completely still. I figured out that there must be a power outage due to the furious lightning outside. It was lightning every couple of seconds, and I found it increasingly difficult to sleep. There was no escaping the constant blue flashes, even with my eyes closed. Covering my eyes under a blanket was not an option, as the weather was warm and sweaty, and the power outage meant I had no way to cool off. As I started twisting left and right trying to find a comfortable position to sleep in, I started to hear a distinctive tapping noise outside my bedroom window, so I rolled over to my right and stared at my bedroom window. The glass on the windows are frosted and opaque, but illuminated by the lightning flashes. I could see the shadows of the trees shaking violently in the wind, but while staring, I couldn't figure out what was causing the tapping noise. There were no trees close enough to my window. My thoughts were drifting away, before being abruptly interrupted by a shadow, which looked like a bird flying into my bedroom window, which was causing the tapping noise. It kept flying into the glass over and over again. Each time it failed to enter my bedroom, it would fly away, cawing like a raven before trying again. I was freaked out by the bird and decided to turn away from the window and go back to sleep. But as I rolled towards my right, a shadowy figure grabbed my hand and pulled me towards the right side. I was taken by surprise, and soon after, fear started settling in, and my heart started racing as I saw what grabbed me. It was a tall and very thin humanoid figure, but very much disfigured. Its hands, arms, legs, body were very thin and slender. I couldn't help but notice, it did not have skin or any recognizable features. It was as if this humanoid figure was a mere dark, pitch black void, very similar to Ventablack. It had no eyes, no face, no mouth, and no ears either. But I do remember seeing very thin dark strides of hair, which were similar to its body. It started pulling me off the bed. I grabbed hold of the wooden siding of my bed and clinged on for dear life, trying my best to stop it from pulling me off. I felt my whole body vibrating, and an intense warm sensation with heavy vibrations around my hand, where it held me in its clutches. I didn't see it move, or even put any effort to pull me off the bed. However, I could feel myself being pulled off. I was drowned in fear, and like a cornered animal, I decided to face whatever was coming my way, and with the amount of fear mounting, I burst out of my lucid dream and I was wide awake. Yet, as I came back to reality, this shadowy figure was still holding onto my hand. It wasn't pulling me anymore, and within a couple of seconds it dissipated into millions of shadows. My hand was floating midair before falling back onto the bed. I was speechless, and in a state of shock after reeling in what I just saw. I grabbed my phone to check the time. It was 3 minutes to 3 a.m., and I turned on my phone's flashlight to check every corner of the room. But it was empty. It was still lightning, and I decided to go back to sleep covering my head with a blanket this time, no matter how warm it was. The next morning I tried connecting the dots to figure out what I had witnessed. I was perplexed as I knew I woke up from a lucid dream, but how was it possible for this humanoid shadow to be present and visible after waking up from a lucid dream? Additionally, during the lucid dream I knew there was a power outage, and after waking up I noticed that there was indeed a power outage. Was I experiencing sleep paralysis? Clearly no, because I was able to move, hold on, roll on my bed throughout the whole nightmarish experience. I've been at the hospital for the last 5 hours. My mother convinced me to leave and get some rest. I'm home, but I can't sleep. I'm sitting here on my sofa, listening to the footsteps in the bedroom. She's pacing, starting and stopping. Her steps uneven as she meanders from point to point. I wonder if she can see. I don't think she can, for I peeked inside and saw her standing half a step from the wall, her shoulders slouching, her entire body slumped to one side over the gaping hole that should have been the right side of her abdomen. I wanted to paint her without eyes, without a face. She knows where things are. She doesn't run into walls or furniture in her aimless wandering, and her attention snapped into focus on the paramedics when they came for my husband. My mouth was dry while they entered the room with the stretcher. They didn't see her, and she merely hovered over them, alert, her head bobbing back and forth on her twig-thin neck. When they left, she resumed her aimless pacing, and she remains there still. It is unsurprising that I'm the only one that can see her. She is mine, after all. They ran a slew of tests on my husband, one after the other. MRI, EEG, whatever they could do to inspect his brain and understand why it stopped responding so abruptly. Why he was in this coma. I kept silent, giving my consent where it was required, but offering nothing more. My mother assumed I was in shock and held my hand and brought me coffee as the night stretched long, and the doctors came back with no answers and carefully restrained optimism. They are trying not to give me hope. I understand what this means. He isn't going to wake up. I could have told him this. I saw what happened. I suppose my life has been building to this point. I've always been creative. I get restless if I haven't made something in a few days. It doesn't have to be much, just something new that wasn't there before. I feel like a junkie, needing my hit. Or perhaps this is just a nervous habit I've built into the bedrock of my routines. I get anxious if I haven't touched my pencils or my paints, or any other medium I've adopted. I'm not an artist. I refrain from using that word. It has connotations I'm not ready to drape over my shoulders like a mantle. It is my hobby. It is something I enjoy. And while I'm better than most people that stopped painting after high school, I lack certain fundamental understandings on how to construct and execute. I paint things. This is the extent of it. My mother always asks me, why don't I paint something nice? I can't explain it. On the walls of my studio room is a smiling woman, looking straight ahead at the viewer, her hands peeling back the skin of her chest so a tree can grow out of the darkness inside. Her hair is tangled in its branches. A man opens his chest like a coat, and something like black smoke, but lined like muscle, tumbles out. There are wolf skull heads inside, with human arms and hands, and they reach out to caress his body. He is screaming. A naked woman cuts her hair off, and it flows into the shadow surrounding her like water, out of which empty eyes watch her kneeling form. I paint these things, again and again, hoping that the next one will better capture the image in my head. There are themes, vacant faces, black lines of ink scrawled over top where the eyes should go, empty rib cages and hollow abdomens, obscene fusions of bone and muscle and paint. I don't paint physical suffering though. My people look at you with calm, serene gazes, accepting, understanding. And when they do cry out, like the man with the wolves, it is an internal turmoil, ripping free of their bodies and surrounding them like a protective, loving entity. We cannot be free of our demons. I don't know why I am this way. I feel compelled to put these visions onto paper, but I have a job. I have obligations. I do not paint enough, and so these ideas linger inside me for days, for months, waiting their turn to be brought forth onto this world. I suppose that's where the trouble started. The first of my creations to escape was a genderless figure, limbs twisted and fingers curled, with a wolf skull rising out of its shoulders, the neck corded like bare muscle, the color of smoke, screaming soundlessly, tongueless mouth gaping, with black ink spilling out of its eye sockets. This was how I envisioned it. I found handprints on the walls of my studio room, like soot smeared on the white drywall, or graphite, or ink. No matter how I scrubbed, I couldn't clean it away, and I finally bought some paint and covered it up. I know it belonged to that creation, for the prints were erratic, like the arms twisted and writhed of their own volition, and the fingertips couldn't lay flat upon the wall. And I saw it, a glimpse of it in the hallway, the body limping along, dragging its twisted ankles, the wolf head bobbing like a balloon. I smelled smoke and ash. Oddly, I wasn't afraid. I felt like I was in a trance, like I was watching myself stand up from my chair and followed out into the hallway. It stood in my living room now, and I went to the doorway and the wolf head swiveled, turning to face me, while the body remained rigidly in place. I blinked and it was gone. The next day I painted it into existence, and it has remained on the paper since. A few days later I found that part of the backyard had caved in. There was a depression, a hollow of churned earth, where the grass had been ripped free in rough, narrow furrows, like 100 hands all clawing their way out of the ground. The feathers of a large black bird were scattered around, and there was a sticky substance like tar lying in thick puddles. My husband filled it back in, cursing the groundhogs, but without conviction, for I heard the confusion in his voice. I remained inside, painting. A pile of human hands clawing and reaching upwards in supplication to a great bird, rendered without ink, that hovered overhead. Its feathers dribbled down to the waiting hands in liquid black lines, blooming into wet spots like spattered blood. I thought these coincidences, a trick of the mind, a wild imagination conjuring up what I wanted to see. How could I trust what I was seeing? Reality was not being honest with me. It presented an impossibility, that the things I nurture inside my mind were affecting the world around me. I wondered if perhaps I should see a doctor. Feared they'd call it anxiety and prescribe a medication and send me on my way, or some more frightening diagnosis that I wasn't ready to consider. I began to look for evidence so that I could either prove or disprove my senses. I stopped painting. I let it build inside my head until cracks began to form in the dam, and I could not hold my creations back. This is when the headaches began, sharp, like a finger pushing through my skull and into my brain. I would lie on the sofa while my husband turned the lights off and told me I should see a doctor, that there were ways to treat migraines. I told him not yet. Not yet. Maybe it'll get better. I needed to know what was happening to me for certain first. And then the neighbor came to visit. On his phone was a photo he wanted us to see. A deer, he said, that he saw standing in our front yard one night after the sun had set. He was taking the trash out to the curb. It watched him, and he stopped to watch it back. As we live in the suburbs and the deer don't come here, there was an odd light to it, he said, that he at first thought was the glare of the streetlight off its fur. Then he realized it was coming from inside, that the deer's mouth was open, and its throat burned like it was on fire, a red-orange glow rimming its nose and mouth and eyes. It finally turned its head away and walked around the house to my backyard, and when he went after it, it was gone, and there was no sign of it anywhere, even though he looked up and down the streets, like a specter, he said. He sounded unnerved, perhaps a little afraid. He showed us the photo, the dark outline of the deer against the backdrop of our house, the colors muted in the poor light, and the glow of the deer's mouth like a star. A deer burning up from the inside. I felt my creation stir somewhere inside my mind, whispering up visions of its uneven antlers and its head thrown back, exhaling embers into the night sky. Even then, I was not yet afraid. My creations, I thought, were benign, self-controlled, understanding the horrors they conjured, and accepting, embracing them. There is one, pinned to the wall like the others, where a woman rips a skeletal bird from her abdomen and holds it aloft so that it might stretch its wings while her blood pools at her feet and mixes with the ink of her hair. It is a triumphant gesture, like justice holding aloft her scales. They are frightening, they are disturbing, but they are mine, and I did not think I had to be afraid. Then last night I was awoken with a headache. This was starting to be normal for me, and I rolled out of bed carefully, so as to not disturb my husband. I went into the living room so that I could sleep on the sofa, or at least try to sleep. Usually I just toss and thrash, and steal bits and pieces of rest where I could. I took some pain meds and lay down on my back, and the pain continued, throbbing at the base of my skull, and it was like my head felt heavy, like something was pulling it down and away from my neck. When I reached back, unsettled by a sensation like a weight at the edge of my skull, I found something there, nestled in among my hair. My fingers crossed on a fleshy cord, warm, resistant like tendon, coated with a thin layer of fat and skin. My heart began to race as I traced its length with my fingertips, and found that it was connected to my body, that had joined seamlessly with my own flesh. I sat up, lungs constricted in horror, not even able to scream yet. A yard away stood the faceless woman. Her flesh was the white of my watercolor paper, and the skin of her arms flaked like ash, black as ink. She had no hair, and her abdomen was torn like a piece of cloth. There was no blood. The cord stretched between us, connecting me to her, and as I watched, she raised her hand and took hold of it with her long fingers. Ripped it free, and blinding pain shot through my head. I fell back onto the sofa senseless as darkness rushed in, and I next remember lying there on the sofa, listening to her walk down the hallway to our bedroom. I rolled off onto my hands and knees on the floor. I was shaking. I wanted to vomit. The cord lay on the ground beside me, withered and decaying into dust as I watched. It was an effort to stand. I stumbled down the hallway, catching myself against the wall with my hands for balance, until I came to the doorway of the bedroom. The woman was inside, leaning over my sleeping husband. Her palms rested on his forehead. As I watched, a vicious, black substance, like congealed ink, began to seep out of his brow. He moved fitfully in his sleep, as if in pain. The liquid flowed over the woman's fingers and up her wrists, seeping into her skin like dye, before being carried away through her body, turning her veins dark. I moved to stop her, to pull her away from him, to stop whatever was happening. I lurched across the floor. The room spun around me, and my knees buckled. I fell heavily to the ground, landing on my hands and knees, and pain shot up my wrists. My mouth was dry, and I could barely move my head, like I was a spinning top, everything going around and around. I crawled to her. I reached up and grabbed her forearm. Her bones were like a statue, immovable, and her skin came away like wet clay and splattered onto the ground in white lumps. She looked down at me once, her face smooth like porcelain. Then she stepped away, and I pulled myself up to stand over my husband. His brow was wet with sweat, and his pillow was damp with dark stains. I shook him, called his name, screamed, and finally even slapped his face. I collapsed, sobbing, beside the bed, and finally when my lungs ached, and all emotion had been wrung from me like a wet rag, I called 911. My creations are no longer content to remain bottled up inside my head. They're starving in there. I can feel their hunger, like fingers driving through the bone of my skull and into my brain. But I cannot allow them to venture forth and seek other prey. They've taken everything from my husband and left him a shell, hooked up to wires and monitors at the hospital, doomed to waste away while his body ages and weakens until death finally comes, long overdue, to remove the vacant flesh from this world. I know what I must do. An artist doesn't create life with their creations. They end it. Life is potential, and to render a dream in paint or ink takes away all possibilities. It makes it a static, known, dead thing. It exists as a single point in time, unable to change or grow inside the artist's mind. I cannot permit an idea to take root for too long inside my head ever again. I will not nurture it. I will not let it grow and be born into this world. I will paint, continuously if I must, until all my ideas are lying dead on pieces of paper. I have to kill my darlings. It all started after I had that damned panic attack. I am a calm person by nature, always have been. Small stuff never bothered me, even while driving, and I certainly had never been so negatively affected by something that I had a breakdown like that. Of all the places for it to happen, it was at work during an important meeting with my boss. Luckily for me, it was a telephone meeting, so I was able to hang up, get my breathing under control, and then call back, blaming my sudden absence on a bad connection. There had been no trigger to speak of. The meeting was going just fine. I was alone in my well-lit office, surrounded by plants and art. But something suddenly hit me like a ton of bricks. No, more like the realization that there was a charging bear coming right for me. Instinct is what my roommate called it when I confided in her later that evening, after I shot down the possibility that I'd just been working too hard. Maybe it's like you knew that something was wrong, Animals can tell when something isn't right, like dogs and cats just before an earthquake. And human beings are just animals when you get down to it, she said just before finishing off the last of her glass of wine. I sipped pensively at my own glass as I stared out the window of our penthouse apartment. Yeah, but human beings need science in order to tell when it's about to earthquake, I sighed. I guess that's true. Well, maybe your brain was just misfiring. Who knows? She left after chatting for a while longer to go meet her boyfriend at a bar across the city, leaving me alone in the apartment. Everything was going just fine. I was rewatching an episode of Friends while I enjoyed my second glass of wine. But then all of a sudden that feeling hit again. Panic, worry, dread, all rolled into one uncomfortable sensation that caused my skin to crawl. Before I knew what I was doing, I was back in the kitchen looking for a knife or something to defend myself. But against what? I had no idea. After settling on a meat tenderizer, I began to patrol the apartment, searching every room top to bottom. But of course, there was nothing to find. Because there was nothing wrong. After schooling myself back into a state of relative ease, I finished off the bottle of wine and another few episodes of television before turning in for the night. I sat up for a little while reading as I always did before sleep, with my blinds closed to shield my room from the city lights. It was about 11:15 when I shut the book and turned off the lamp. The moment the light faded from the room, the panic returned with a vengeance, and once again I found my body moving before my mind could intervene. I threw open the blinds, allowing the city lights to pour in, but that did nothing to calm me down. As I stood there in the dim lighting, I could feel the anxiety focus in a little bit. Soon I had a pretty good idea what I was so scared of. Something was coming to get me. What or why I didn't know, but I knew it. I knew it deep down in my DNA. I didn't sleep that night, suffice to say. My roommate didn't return either, which didn't help, although she texted me later in the morning to inform me that she had spent the night at her boyfriend's. Around lunchtime, I decided it would be a good idea to go out, so that at least I was surrounded by people, and if anything happened, they could maybe help. How wrong I was. The moment I hit the streets, I felt more exposed than ever. I knew that whatever it was that was coming, it could come from any direction. The ground, the sky, left, right, behind and forward. Being in the open like this wasn't safe, but I also knew that my apartment wouldn't be much help, so I found myself moving toward the police station. I had no idea if they would help, or even believe me. I knew that I wouldn't if I was them, but maybe they would agree to let me stay there or something. Unfortunately, I was only halfway there when the feeling got so much worse. What had been anxious worry and suspicion turned quickly into terror. Desperately, I swung my head back and forth to scan my surroundings. I was across from a park where a group of children were playing catch with their dad. Some old men were playing chess under a tree, and a busker in the road was strumming gently at an acoustic guitar. Nobody around was threatening at all, but I knew in the back of my skull that it was getting closer, and it wouldn't be long until it arrived. I knew then that the police couldn't help me, so I turned up street, kicked off my high heels, and began a full-on sprint to the downtown cathedral. People stared, some laughing and pointing at me, but none of that mattered. Only survival did. As the tall spires of the church came into view down the street, I felt a small pang of relief, and momentarily slowed my sprint to a jog. But that was short-lived as an image forced its way through my eyeballs and into my mind. A grinning figure, tall, gaunt, wearing a bathrobe with a massive chest wound, with protruding ribs. No, not ribs. Fingers. Big long fingers. Reaching, catching, clutching fingers. The woman, man, thing's lips were rotten and blistered with crusty yellow slime, and a few spots of the stuff stained its white bathrobe. Where it was I didn't know, but I knew it would be coming for me soon. So soon, in fact, that there was no point in running anymore. I stopped in the streets, hands slack at my side, and tilted my face up to the skyscrapers around me and the blue sky above them. Tears rolling down my face, I stood and still stand, waiting for it to get me.